Since I believe that spinning tackle is the most universal tackle that an angler can own, choosing one stands to reason it could be important. Now, just because the tackle itself, by style, is very universal, doesn't mean all the rods are created equally, and they're certainly not. So let's talk a little bit about choosing a spinning rod for a specific application. First of all, if you're throwing primarily live bait, okay, I primarily throw worms, or I throw leeches or minnows, I throw a bobber or whatever. Really, you're just looking for a long, relatively soft fishing rod, and that's not really something we're here to talk a lot about today. We're here really to talk a little bit more about throwing some sort of lures and more specific, presentations than that. The live bait rods are very soft, very supple, so that the bait doesn't go flying off the hook. When you throw them, generally the casting strokes are different, things like that. So that scenario is a little bit more universal. In that case, a lot of times I'm going to gravitate to an ugly stick. A long, medium, or medium light powered ugly stick, and maybe something in the 7-foot range. Going to be a great bait rod for a guy that's just generally trout or maybe walleye fishing, stuff like that, or if you're just a general all-around bank angler. If you're going to be a catfish guy or something like that, maybe the same concept of a heavier ugly stick. So such that regardless of what rod you're choosing, the weight that the rod's designed to throw is within the range of the lures or the live bait weight that you're going to throw. So if you're a catfish guy and you're throwing 1/2-ounce egg sinkers, you need a rod big enough to deal with catfish and 1/2-ounce egg sinkers. This rod's not heavy enough for you. Conversely, if you're maybe an ultralight guy throwing nothing but a fly in a bubble, well, then maybe I need a rod that's a little bit lighter. But either way, the weight of the rod is going to be printed right on it, of the weight that it's designed to throw, and that's dictated by the power that the rod is, that's built into the rod blank. So day in and day out, a medium power rod is going to be your average all-around spinning rod for bass, walleye, light duty stuff. Maybe a medium heavy if you're more of a big fish guy, like say pike, things like that, because your lures are bigger and heavier. Okay, but and then medium light, of course, for all your finesse stuff for trout and finesse bass, finesse walleye, stuff like that. But that's generally all dictated by the power of the rod. And most of my rods are somewhere between light and medium heavy as far as spinning rods go. I don't have very many heavy powered spinning rods. When I need something that heavy, I generally move to a casting tackle. Okay. Next thing I'm going to look at is the speed in the blank, and the speed is where along the blank the rod will bend. So a fast action rod bends more at the tip. An extra fast bends only at the tip, whereas a more moderate rod will bend down here through the middle of the blank. Moderate rods are most commonly associated with either bait fishing or something that you're going to throw and just wind back to you at full speed, something like a crankbait. Because the bait's moving at high speed, the fish get a bite on it, the rod's more forgiving in general in terms of being able to feel what that fish does, and for the fish to get a clean bite on the bait itself because the rod responds to the fish. So that's when I'm going to look at a more moderate speed. Day in and day out, for anything that's a finesse type presentation where I need excellent feel, I'm going for a faster, extra fast rod. Really important. The other thing that's really important is when you go to spend money on your spinning rod, spend the bulk of your money on your finesse rods. So for instance, this particular one's got an unweighted MaxScent General on it that we've been playing with here this morning. That unweighted General does not have a tremendous amount of feel to it as it's sinking through the water column. I need to be able to feel what the fish are doing. Hence, it's on a very high quality rod. Conversely, a very high modulus graphite, very light, very sensitive. Something like this jerkbait is a very aggressive technique. It's really hard coming through the water column. The way I'm working the bait is very hard and aggressive. The bites are going to be potentially while the bait is moving. So now I've got a veracity blank. I've got a much beefier blank as far as what's built into the blank to deal with the punishment of the lure, okay? But in this case, I've still got an extra fast. And somebody's going to say, why? You have treble hooks and a bait that's moving. Well, because most of my bites are when the bait's paused, for one, and therefore I can feel them better with the faster blank. And for two, the other thing about it is it gives me the very precise control. So if I want to work a topwater bait on the surface and I want it to be in perfect control, the extra fast rod helps me a lot. If I want to be real crisp with the action of my jerkbait, the extra fast action rod will help me a lot with that. So that's when I'm choosing my rods, I'm looking at both the power and the speed of the blank as it relates to the techniques that I'm looking at. So having said all that, if I'm choosing one spinning rod for all my bass and walleye and all that stuff, it's going to be a pretty good quality blank, something probably is going to end up costing me around $100. But it's going to be somewhere between 6.5 and 7 feet long. It's going to be medium power for sure, and it's going to be a fast action rod. It's not going to be extra fast for an all-around spinning rod because, again, I might be winding a crankbait or something like that with. So that's how I'm looking at choosing my spinning rod itself. Most all of my spinning rods are the split grip design. That's kind of become an industry standard. The rods hang in your hand, as we've been demonstrating this morning very well. That's a really important aspect. So you're going to see the split grip design very commonly throughout the whole thing. And then another thing that I like is exposed reel seats, so that there's some part of the blank available right here to my hands to get a hold of. So when my fingers wrap around, the sensitive part of my fingers right on this blank right here to help transmit vibration from this end of the rod through to my hand, and I can feel what's going on with it. So that's generally how I'm choosing my rods day in and day out. When it comes to line for a spinning rod, most of the time, I mean like 99% of the time, my spinning rods are spooled with either a light braided line somewhere between 8 and 15 pound test, maybe 20 or 30 even if I'm going into saltwater situations, but almost always it's going to be somewhere in freshwater between 8 and 15 pounds, maybe 20 on the outside on my pike rods, okay? Light braided line like X9, it's a 9 filament carrier. It's very supple. It handles line twist very, very well. Although you still have to manage slack like a good angler, it will do the best job of that. It's very sensitive, has very low stretch. I can get a hook set from way out there. And more important than all of that is I can control my bait very crisply from wherever I happen to be. I can put a tiny little twitch at this end of the rod and it will make a tiny little twitch at that end of the rod, okay? Braided line floats, and that's a key thing to keep in mind. If I want to put a jig down on the bottom, or I'm going to fish a bait that's subsurface that's continuously moving, a lot of the time I'm going to go to a fluorocarbon line. And Berkley makes a fluorocarbon XL. This is 6 pound trilene 100% fluorocarbon XL, which stands for extra limp. This is specifically formulated to be softer so that it's, again, a little easier to deal with. It's not quite so stiff, such that if you had traditional regular fluorocarbon and you open the spool, it's just going to keep jumping off here on its own because of the memory. This is 6 pound XL, so it doesn't do that nearly as much. It's 6 pound fluorocarbon XL. It doesn't do it nearly as much. The fluorocarbon XL is so much less stiff that it does a great job of allowing me to manage slack line. As long as I do my part as an angler, it doesn't exacerbate the situation and make it even worse. So that's what I'll throw with that. Holds knots well. My rods, most of them, my jig rods, if I'm fishing around rock or gravel, I have fluorocarbon on them. If I'm fishing around wood cover or I'm fishing around grass, I'm most commonly going to have braid on them. If I'm making really long throws or fishing very deep below the boat, I'm going to have braid on them. If I'm fishing at closer range, I'm going to have fluorocarbon because it's more forgiving at closer range. So those are key parts of my system as well. My fluorocarbon generally is going to be somewhere between 6 and 8 pound. There's almost no case where I go to 10 or heavier fluorocarbon on a spinning rod, because it's just too stiff of line. I find I can do better with a 10 or 15 pound braided line, then that's how I end up going that route. Another thing you'll notice about these two reels, the spool diameters are slightly different. This reel's got a smaller spool, this reel's got a bigger spool. The reason is this reel is set up for braided line, so I choose one size smaller. Braided line doesn't need the big spool diameter, so it handles better coming off the spool, so I can get away with a smaller, lighter reel in that case, okay? The fluorocarbon line prefers to have less tight of coils to it, so I use a bigger diameter spool. Less wraps have to come off the spool for a given cast, and it increases both my casting range and it lessens my memory. So that's how I'll choose those. So generally, if I'm going to do a 6 or 8 pound fluorocarbon, it's going to be in a 30 or 35 size reel. And if I'm going to do my 8 to 15 pound braid, it's going to be in a 20 or 25 size reel. That's generally how I'll choose those to match my rods. The other thing you need to look at for your casting reels is retrieve speed, or how much line it takes in each time the handle goes around the spool right here. So in this hand, I've got a Revo winch. This is made to throw crankbait specifically, and it's made to have very low resistance as you wind a bait in. It's got a big giant diameter spool, and it's got a very low gear ratio on this, and it'll tell me right on here somewhere how much line it takes per turn. Let me see here. It's going to take in 4.7 to 1 gear ratio, and so it's a very low gear ratio, okay? The Revo Rocket, on the other hand, is the opposite of the spectrum. It's the fastest reel they make. It's a 7 to 1 gear ratio, so it's about 40% faster every time this handle goes around, retrieving line in. So it's a very quick reel, but it will also create more winding resistance. It takes more power to wind this reel. It's kind of like your truck being in a different gear. Your truck's now in 4th gear. Takes more to get that truck rolling versus this one where your truck is in 2nd gear and you can get it rolling no problem with that. So that's the difference in those two reels. The slow gear ratios are generally for me only for a bait like a crankbait, like this bad shad or a flicker shad, that I'm gonna throw it out and just wind it in. And it's because there's no resistance right here. I can feel everything the bait is doing, okay? So that's what that comes down to for choosing your reel.